It all began on a quiet autumn afternoon when the golden sunlight streamed gently through the lace curtains of Grandpa Henry's living room, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. The air smelled of cinnamon tea, freshly baked bread, and the faint hint of old leather-bound books that had sat on the same shelf for decades. It was the kind of scent that could only be found in a house like Grandpa's, a place frozen in time but warm with familiarity. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, leafing through an old photo album as Henry sat in his favorite armchair, eyes distant, rubbing his thumb slowly over the face of his old pocket watch. It was something he did without thinking, a quiet habit that had become part of his daily routine. The watch, with its bronze sheen dulled by time, had been with him for as long as Emma could remember. Every birthday, every holiday visit, she had seen him take it out, glance at the time, and then slip it back into his vest pocket as if it were his most prized possession. On this particular afternoon, however, something was different. As he turned the watch in his hand, the chain caught on the armrest of his chair, and before either of them could react, the watch slipped from his fingers. It fell with a sharp metallic clatter against the wooden floor, the sound so loud that it seemed to echo longer than it should have. Henry gasped softly, leaning forward in his chair with a pained look on his face, as if it were more than just an object that had hit the ground. Emma's heart jumped. She rushed over, scooping it up before he could even move. "It's all right, Grandpa, I got it," she said quickly, holding it in her hands. But as she flipped it over, her breath hitched. A thin crack snaked across the glass face, and she could hear a faint rattling sound from inside. She glanced at him, her face laced with concern. "It's broken," she said softly, turning it over in her hands as if trying to reverse time itself. Henry leaned back in his chair with a long, heavy sigh. "I suppose everything breaks eventually," he muttered, his eyes focused on a spot in the distance, far away from where they were. The sadness in his voice made Emma's chest ache. It wasn't like him to sound so defeated. He was the strong one, the quiet but steady force in their family. This wasn't just about a watch. "I can fix it," Emma said suddenly, the words coming out of her mouth before she had fully thought them through. Her eyes darted to him, waiting for his approval. "I'm serious, Grandpa. I fixed my dad's old radio, remember? I'm good with this kind of stuff." Henry gave a small, tired chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This watch isn't a toy, kiddo," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It's older than you, older than me in some ways." His eyes settled on her then, his gaze firm but not unkind. "You don't understand. Some things are meant to stay the way they are." But Emma wasn't the kind to give up. She wasn't a little girl anymore, and she hated seeing her grandfather like this, so resigned, so willing to let go of something he loved. She glanced down at the watch again, tracing the crack on its face with her thumb. "Come on, Grandpa," she urged, her voice light but insistent. "It's just gears and screws. I'll be gentle with it." She looked up at him, her eyes steady with the kind of quiet stubbornness that had always made her mother call her hard-headed. For a long moment, Henry didn't say anything. His lips pressed into a line, his jaw working as if he were chewing on a thought too big to swallow. Finally, he nodded, letting out a slow breath through his nose. "All right," he said with a weary smile. "But be careful with it, Emma. This watch has seen things you wouldn't believe." Her brows raised at that. "Like what?" she asked, only half joking. But he only shook his head and waved his hand as if brushing the question aside. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath. He placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it for a moment before pulling away. "Take care of it, okay?" That night, Emma sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by the soft hum of her apartment. The only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of the old wooden chair she sat on. Laid out before her were her tools, a magnifying glass, a set of small screwdrivers, tweezers, and a flashlight. In the center of it all was her grandfather's watch, its bronze frame catching the dim glow of the kitchen light like an old treasure from another world. She felt a sense of reverence as she picked it up, turning it slowly in her hands. It was heavier than it looked. It wasn't just the weight of metal, it was the weight of history, of something that had seen lifetimes of moments too small to be noticed but too big to be forgotten. Emma worked with the steady hands of someone who had been fixing things since childhood. She unscrewed the tiny backplate, careful not to damage the fragile parts within. Inside, she was met with a delicate, intricate dance of gears, cogs, and springs, a mechanical heart that had been ticking for longer than she had been alive. She smiled to herself, feeling a little thrill of pride as she cleaned the inner workings with a precision brush. It was a world of its own in there, a place where every part mattered. It reminded her of her grandfather, strong on the outside, but inside, it was all about balance, precision, and care. Hours passed in silence as she adjusted each gear, making sure they moved smoothly. Her eyes flickered with determination, her fingers steady as she clipped the last gear into place. But just as she prepared to close the backplate, something unusual caught her eye. There was a faint, almost invisible seam running along the edge of one of the larger gears. Her brow furrowed. She leaned in closer, narrowing her eyes. It didn't make sense. She tapped it lightly with her screwdriver, and to her surprise, it shifted, just a tiny click. Her heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she pressed her fingernail into the seam, her breath held tight in her chest. With a soft pop, the small compartment opened, revealing a narrow, hidden slot inside the watch's frame. Her fingers hovered for a moment, nerves tingling. She reached in, pulling out a thin, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, so delicate that it crinkled at the lightest touch. Her heart pounded as she unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the words written in faded ink. Her lips moved as she read it quietly, barely able to make out the old-fashioned script. It was a letter. No, not just a letter. It was a message. For words stood at the top, bold and clear. For Eleanor, only you. Her eyes darted back to her grandfather's name etched inside the watch cover. H.W. Everly. Her pulse quickened. Eleanor. She didn't know any Eleanor in her family. Who was she? And why was this message hidden so carefully? She sat back in her chair, gripping the letter in her hand, her heart thudding against her ribcage like a hammer. Questions swirled in her mind, sharp and endless. Why had he never mentioned this name? Why was it hidden? Her eyes flickered to her phone. She could call him now. She could ask. But something in her gut told her that she might not like the answer. For Eleanor, only you. She repeated the words in her head like a riddle, each syllable feeling heavier than the last. Her grandfather had always told her that some things are better left unsaid. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't one of them. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her eyes locked on the small, folded piece of paper resting in her palm. Her breathing was slow but shallow, as if even the slightest breath might blow the delicate paper away. It felt wrong to open it, like opening someone else's diary or reading a letter that wasn't meant for her. But it was already too late. Her hands had already done the work. She had already found the compartment, pulled out the paper, and now it sat there, daring her to look inside. Her fingertips tingled with nerves as she ran them over the crinkled edge of the paper. It was old, that much was clear. The yellowish tint of the paper, the brittle edges, and the faint musty smell of something that had been tucked away for decades told her everything she needed to know. This letter, this message, it had been hidden on purpose. But why? And for how long? Her eyes shifted to the watch still lying open on the table, the backplate removed like an exposed secret. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. This watch has seen things you wouldn't believe. At the time, she had dismissed it as nothing more than old man talk. But now she wasn't so sure. Her hands moved with a kind of slow reverence, like she was handling a fragile artifact in a museum. She unfolded the paper, careful not to tear it. The creases were so sharp that it took a few gentle tugs to fully open it. Her eyes scanned the handwriting, and for a moment, she had to blink a few times to adjust. The ink was faded, but the script was still readable, written in a cursive style that looked far more elegant than anything people wrote today. It was the kind of handwriting you only see on old postcards or in letters from the war. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but the words hit her with the weight of something far bigger than the paper they were written on. To Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I have failed you. There are things I couldn't face, things I couldn't change. I hope you can forgive me. Forever yours, Henry. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted back to the name at the bottom, Henry. It wasn't just any Henry. It was her Henry, her grandfather. Her hands began to tremble as she reread the message, her eyes scanning it over and over, hoping it would somehow make more sense on the third, fourth, or fifth read. If you're reading this, then I have failed you. Those words clung to her like a fog, thick and suffocating. Failed her? Failed Eleanor? What could he have possibly failed at? Her grandfather wasn't a man who ever talked about failure. He was the kind of person who believed that, no matter what, you just kept moving forward. He had lived through wars, recessions, and the loss of his beloved wife Ruth. Through it all, he never once spoke of regret. Not once. But here, on this tiny scrap of paper, he admitted to failure. And not just failure, it was directed at someone specific. Eleanor. Emma's pulse quickened. She pressed her hands flat on the table, trying to steady herself, her eyes locked on the letter like it might change if she blinked. To Eleanor. The name echoed in her head louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Eleanor. It wasn't a name she recognized, not in any family stories, not in any conversations with her mom, not even in any of the photo albums she had flipped through on the shelves in Grandpa's living room. It wasn't a family name. It wasn't someone she had ever heard her grandfather mention. She sat back in her chair, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if she could hold herself together that way. Who the hell is Eleanor? She muttered, glancing toward the hallway where her grandfather's room sat. He was still asleep, the rhythmic hiss of his CPAP machine humming softly through the walls. Her mind was spinning now, pieces of a puzzle that she didn't even know existed suddenly falling into place. A secret name, a message of failure, a hidden letter tucked inside a watch. The what? Her eyes flicked back to it, its gears and cogs still exposed on the table. Her stomach twisted with an uncomfortable realization. This wasn't something small. This wasn't a random message from an old friend. People don't hide apologies inside watches for no reason. People don't tuck letters away for strangers. No, this was something personal, something deep. Her fingers moved on their own, folding the paper back along its creases with slow precision, as if she were tucking away a living, breathing secret. She placed it back in the hidden compartment of the watch and clicked it shut, her heart racing the entire time. For a brief second, she considered sealing it back up and pretending she'd never seen it. She even sat back in her chair and stared at it, her mind at war with itself. Leave it alone, she whispered to herself, rubbing her hands down her face. It's not your story. It's his. But that thought didn't sit well with her. No, it wasn't just his story anymore. He had hidden that letter in a place where someone would eventually find it. And now she had. There was no putting it back. Her eyes stayed locked on the watch, her gaze sharp with curiosity and unease. She knew what she had to do, but she didn't want to admit it to herself. She needed to know who Eleanor was. She needed to know what this promise was that her grandfather had failed to keep. Her heart tugged her toward it like the invisible pull of a magnet, and no matter how hard she tried to resist, it was already too late. Her phone buzzed on the table, the sudden vibration snapping her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly, half expecting it to be her mother or some cosmic sign from the universe. But it was just a spam notification. Her eyes flicked to the clock. 12:13 a.m. She sighed, letting her head drop back against the chair. She didn't know if it was the late hour or the emotional weight of the discovery, but her body suddenly felt heavy. Her legs felt like concrete. Her head felt foggy. Her mind was still reeling, playing back every interaction she'd had with her grandfather, every holiday dinner, every conversation where he talked about the good old days. How many of those stories were real? How many of them had pieces missing? She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd only ever been given half the truth. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf in the corner of the kitchen. It was cluttered with old photo albums, recipe books, and notebooks filled with Grandma Ruth's handwritten cooking instructions. Her feet moved on their own this time, pulling her toward it. She reached up and grabbed the oldest-looking photo album, its spine cracked and faded with age. As she flipped through it, her fingers brushed over black and white photos of weddings, military uniforms, and small-town parades. Faces of smiling strangers stared back at her, nameless but somehow familiar. She searched for the name Eleanor written on the backs of photos but found nothing. She checked the family tree page near the front, running her finger down each name. No Eleanor. No mention of her anywhere. Her frustration grew as she shoved the album back on the shelf. It felt like chasing a ghost. But ghosts don't leave letters behind. People do. People with regrets. People with stories too heavy to carry on their own. Emma sat back down at the table, her elbows resting on the edge, her hands tangled in her hair. The watch was still there, closed and quiet, but now it didn't feel like an ordinary watch anymore. It felt like something bigger, something she wasn't supposed to find but had been chosen to carry. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing on it like it might crack under her gaze. "All right, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking kitchen clock. "Who are you?" She had no idea what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, Emma woke up with that name still lodged in her mind like a thorn she couldn't pull out. Eleanor. It echoed in her thoughts the way a catchy song does, repeating itself at the oddest moments. She had dreamed about it, though the details of the dream were already fading away like mist in the sunlight. She sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, feeling an unusual weight in her chest. For a moment, she thought maybe she should let it go. People have secrets, she told herself. Just because you found one doesn't mean you have to open it. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. Her curiosity had already taken root. The moment she saw her grandfather's name signed at the bottom of that letter, it stopped being just his story. It was hers now, too. Her eyes shifted to the small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside it was the watch, locked tight, just as she had left it the night before. It felt strange knowing that something so small could carry so much weight. Her fingers hovered over the box lid for a second, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Today she had a mission. She needed answers. She got up, threw on a hoodie and jeans, and started her morning routine. Coffee, toast, scroll through social media. But even as her phone screen flashed with updates from friends, news, and pointless notifications, her mind wasn't there. It was still on Eleanor. And with every sip of coffee, the question only grew louder. Who was Eleanor? Her mom would be at work until late, so calling her wouldn't do any good. Grandpa was out of the question, She knew he'd shut down the moment she asked. That left one option. She'd have to find out on her own. Her first thought was the old family photo albums at Grandpa's house. There were at least 4 of them, each one packed with faded photographs of family reunions, Christmas mornings, and snapshots of everyday life that no one thought much of at the time. If there was a woman named Eleanor in his life, she'd be in one of those photos. She had to be. Emma made up her mind. "I'll go back to Grandpa's house," she said, setting her coffee mug down with more force than necessary. It was only a 15-minute drive, and she knew he'd still be home, probably watching one of his old black and white westerns. She grabbed her keys, threw on her sneakers, and headed for the door, heart thudding in her chest like she was sneaking into a crime scene. When she arrived, Grandpa Henry's house looked the same as it always did, old but solid, like it had been carved out of something stronger than wood and stone. The garden was overgrown, as usual, weeds creeping up around the base of the porch steps. She climbed them carefully, her eyes darting toward the living room window. Sure enough, she saw the faint flicker of the TV and the outline of her grandfather in his chair. She felt a twist of guilt in her gut. It wasn't like she was doing anything wrong, but it felt wrong, like she was about to trespass on something sacred. She hesitated on the porch for a moment, fingers hovering over the doorbell, but then she took a breath and pushed it. The chime echoed through the house, and a few seconds later, she heard the slow shuffle of her grandfather's feet on the hardwood floor. The door opened, revealing his familiar face, eyes squinting against the sunlight. He looked at her with mild surprise, his face softening into a small smile. "Emma, what you doing here, kid?" "Just thought I'd stop by," she said, forcing her voice to sound light and casual. "Had some free time today." "Well, come on in," he said, stepping aside. "Coffee's still hot if you want some." She stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the living room, taking in the familiar sight of his recliner, the smell of old wood, and the quiet hum of the TV. She sat on the couch, acting like nothing was on her mind, but she could feel the weight of the mission she'd come here to do. As he walked to the kitchen, she glanced toward the bookshelf. There they were, the old family photo album stacked neatly on the second shelf. Her heart skipped a beat. That's where she'd start. When her grandfather returned with 2 mugs of coffee, Emma forced herself to stay calm. They chatted for a while about small things, the weather, his neighbor's dog that kept digging up the yard, and how much grocery prices had gone up. But all the while, her eyes kept flicking to the bookshelf. Eventually, she leaned forward, setting her coffee down on the table. "Hey, Grandpa," she said casually, "do you mind if I look through the old photo albums?" His brow furrowed slightly, his eyes flicking toward the shelf. "Photo albums?" "Yeah," she said, tilting her head toward them. "I was thinking about that trip we took to Lake Shady when I was a kid. Wanted to see if there were any pictures of it in there." His expression stayed neutral for a second too long. Then he shrugged. "Yeah, sure. Knock yourself out." He waved it off like it was nothing, but his eyes lingered on her just a little too long before he turned back to the TV. Emma swallowed hard, trying to push away the nagging feeling in her chest. He knows. She got up slowly, moving toward the bookshelf. Her fingers brushed the spines of the old albums, each one labeled with thick black marker. 1980 to 1989, 1990 to 1999, 2000 to 2009. She pulled one of them out, her heart already racing, and brought it to the table. Her grandfather glanced at her, but didn't say anything. She flipped it open, turning page after page, her eyes scanning every face. It was the same as she remembered. Holiday parties, summer picnics, her own chubby toddler face grinning in a too-tight swimsuit. But there was no Eleanor. No names on the backs of the photos. Nothing. "Find what you're looking for?" her grandfather asked from his chair. Her heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "Not yet," she said, giving a small laugh. You guys really love that beach, huh? He smiled at that. Best summers of my life. His voice sounded distant, like he was already drifting back to those days. She turned another page, her breath caught in her throat. There, tucked between 2 pages, was something small and folded. Her fingers stopped. Another letter. No, not a letter. It was a small photograph. She slid it out slowly, careful not to let it crumple. It was a black and white photo of a man and a woman standing side by side. The man was young, wearing a military uniform with the same broad shoulders and sharp jawline that her grandfather had when he was younger. But it wasn't the man that caught her attention. It was the woman. She was beautiful, not in a glamorous magazine cover way, but in a way that felt real. Her hair was pulled back, and she had a look on her face that could only be described as brave, confident, and at the bottom, in tiny black ink, what a name. Henry and Eleanor, 1954. Emma's fingers tightened on the edges of the photo. Her heart felt like it had been knocked off balance. She turned it over, searching for more information, but the back was blank. Her breathing slowed as she stared at it, her mind racing. She glanced at her grandfather. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the TV, his face calm, his expression unreadable. He knew she'd find it. He had to. "Hey, Grandpa," she said, holding the photo up like it was nothing. "Who's Eleanor?" The second the name left her lips, she saw it. The shift, the flicker of something in his eyes. It was only a second, but it was there. He didn't move. He didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet sigh, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together like a man about to confess. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the floor. "She was somebody I owed a lot to," he said quietly. "Some debts you never really get to pay back." Emma stayed quiet, her fingers still clutching the photo. She could feel it now, like the weight of something bigger than both of them had settled into the room. This was only the beginning. The silence in the room felt thicker than any words could have been. It hung in the air like fog after a storm, slow and unmoving. Emma sat across from her grandfather, eyes darting between his face and the photograph of him and Eleanor. Her fingers traced the edge of the photo, her thumb running over the name Eleanor, like it might suddenly rewrite itself into something she understood. But it didn't. It stayed right there, bold and undeniable. Henry and Eleanor, 1954. Her heart felt heavier than it had when she woke up, like every answer she'd uncovered so far had only led to bigger, harder questions. Her eyes stayed on her grandfather. His gaze was still fixed on a floor, his hands folded together like he was about to say grace before a meal. But he wasn't praying. He was thinking. Hard. Emma knew that look. It was the look he gave every time he didn't want to talk about something. It was the same look he had when her mom asked him why he never talked about his time in the military. The same look he had when someone mentioned Grandma Ruth's illness. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness either. It was something deeper. Regret, maybe. Or guilt. It was hard to tell with him sometimes. But she'd seen it enough times to know that whatever was about to come out of his mouth, it wasn't going to be easy. She waited. She didn't push him, didn't ask another question. She just held the photo lightly in her hands, letting it sit between them like a third person at the table. Finally, he let out a slow breath, his lips pressing together like he was trying to trap the words inside. His fingers rubbed against each other, his eyes still focused on the floor. "I met Eleanor when I was stationed in Germany," he said quietly, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken in days. 1954. I was 24. Just a dumb kid back then. Barely knew anything about the world. He glanced up at her for the first time, his eyes sharper than they'd been all morning. She was smart, though. Smarter than me. Always was. Emma's fingers gripped the photo tighter. She didn't dare say anything, didn't want to break whatever fragile thread he was following. She'd learned a long time ago that sometimes, when people finally decide to tell you something important, you just have to let them talk. No interruptions. No questions. Just listen. So she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her eyes locked on him like he was telling her the most important story she'd ever hear. Eleanor was different, he continued, his words slower now, like every one of them had to be pulled up from the bottom of a deep well. She wasn't like the other girls back home. She didn't care about fancy dresses or being someone's housewife. She had this fire in her, like she knew she was meant for more. She spoke 4 languages. Can you believe that? He chuckled softly, but there was no joy in it. It was a laugh filled with old memories, the kind of laugh you give when something was beautiful once but too far gone now. She didn't take no nonsense from anyone, least of all me. I think that's why I liked her. Emma tilted her head, her heart starting to thump a little harder in her chest. This wasn't just some old war story. He wasn't just talking about a friend. This was something more. We were supposed to leave Germany in '55, he continued, his eyes distant, his hands still rubbing together like he was trying to scrub something off his skin. But Eleanor, she had plans. She didn't want to stay behind. Said she'd come with me. His voice grew quieter as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes lost in a memory Emma couldn't see. I told her it wouldn't be that simple. Told her they wouldn't let her leave with me. But she was stubborn. You remind me of her sometimes. You know that? That look in your eyes when you've made up your mind about something. Emma felt her chest tighten. It was strange hearing him say that. He'd never compared her to anyone before. Not even her mom. She glanced down at the photo again, her eyes focused on the woman's face. Strong, steady, sure of herself. Yeah, Emma could see it now. The resemblance wasn't in the face, but in the spirit. What happened? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandfather rubbed his hands over his face like he was trying to wipe away everything he was feeling. His breath came out slow and shaky, his eyes staring at the kitchen table, unfocused. I promised her I'd take her with me. His voice cracked on the last word, and Emma's heart dropped. He shook his head, his eyes closing tight like he was trying to hold back tears. But I didn't. I didn't take her with me, Emma. Silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're underwater. Emma sat there, her body frozen, her heart aching for him in a way she didn't fully understand. She wanted to say something, anything, but nothing felt right. Why not? She asked softly, her words like tiny stones dropped into a still pond. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and she saw something she'd never seen in him before, shame. Real, raw shame. Because I was scared, he said, his voice bitter like it hurt him to say it out loud. I was scared of what people would think. Scared of what my father would say. Scared of what it would cost me to keep that promise. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face as he let out a long, broken sigh. Back then, you didn't bring a woman like Eleanor home. Not where I grew up. Not where I lived. Emma's breath caught in her chest. A woman like Eleanor. It hit her like a hammer to the ribs. She didn't need him to say it outright. She understood exactly what he meant. She glanced back at the photo. Her eyes traced the soft waves of Eleanor's hair, her sharp, bright eyes, and the warmth of her skin, darker than his, even in black and white. She was black, wasn't she? Emma asked, her voice steady but full of weight. Does she know? Emma asked, her eyes locked on him. Does she know why you left? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way his hand stayed pressed to his face told her everything. Emma sat back, letting out a slow, shaky breath. This was bigger than she'd expected. This wasn't just a letter. This wasn't just an old photograph. This was a man's whole life, his mistakes, his regrets, his shame, all wrapped up in 4 lines of ink on a scrap of paper. If you're reading this, then I have failed you. Those words made more sense now. They weren't just an apology. They were a confession. Her eyes shifted back to the watch on the table. It had always been with him. Everywhere he went. Every year. Every family reunion. Every holiday dinner. The weight of it suddenly made more sense. It wasn't just a watch. It was a reminder. A reminder of Eleanor. A reminder of the promise he'd broken. He carried it because he couldn't carry her. Emma wiped her eyes, not even realizing when they'd started to water. She looked back at her grandfather. He wasn't crying, but his face was so full of pain, it might as well have been tears. "You know," she said softly, her voice steady now, "it's not too late, Grandpa." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something new in them, hope. Small, faint, but it was there. "You think so?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She reached out, placing her hand over his. Her grip was firm, steady, just like Eleanor's face in the photo. "I know so," she said, "but you have to want it." He nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around hers. "Maybe it's time." The air in the house felt heavier than it had in years. Emma could feel it pressing down on her shoulders, as if the weight of her grandfather's past had shifted onto her. The quiet hum of the television buzzed in the background, but neither of them was watching it. Her grandfather sat across from her, his eyes still fixed on a spot on the floor, like he was staring into a part of his life he'd never fully left. His hands rested on his knees, motionless but tense, like he was bracing himself for something. Emma sat on the edge of the couch, fingers drumming softly on the armrest, her mind racing as fast as her heartbeat. She had heard stories about racism from school, from books, from television, but this was different. This was close. This was him. This was her grandfather, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike and told her bedtime stories. Her eyes flickered to the watch on the table, lying face down with its backplate slightly open. She hadn't touched it since last night, but she could feel its presence as if it had eyes watching her. That watch had been carrying a story all these years, and now so was she. It was funny how one crack in a piece of glass could crack open everything. She glanced back at her grandfather, his shoulders hunched forward, his jaw tight. For the first time in her life, he didn't look unbreakable. He looked a human. "Do you ever think about her?" Emma asked softly, not looking up from the watch. Her fingers hovered over it like she wasn't sure if she should pick it up again. Her grandfather's hands rubbed slowly over his knees, back and forth, like he was trying to wear down his own hesitation. Every day, he muttered, his voice as quiet as a breath but as heavy as a stone. Some days more than others. Her chest tightened at the sound of it. Her fingers finally stopped tapping, and she sat up straighter. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting his. "All these years, Grandpa. You kept this locked up like it was something to be ashamed of." "Why?" He blinked slowly, his lips pressing together. His eyes shifted to hers, filled with something she wasn't used to seeing, vulnerability. "What would it have changed, Emma?" he asked, his voice sharp but not angry. More like he was asking himself. Would it have made it better for her? For me? He shook his head, eyes distant. "No, I thought if I didn't say it out loud, maybe it would hurt less. Maybe I could forget." His laugh was bitter and hollow. "But you don't forget, kid. Not something like that. Emma's throat felt tight. She didn't know if she wanted to be angry at him or feel sorry for him. Both maybe. He had lived with this weight for so long that it had shaped him, worn him down from the inside out. She could see it now, all the cracks that had been there her whole life, hidden beneath his quiet strength. "I don't think Grandma would have judged you, Grandpa," she said carefully, watching his reaction. "I don't think she would have thought less of you for it." At the mention of Grandma Ruth, his eyes closed slowly, his face scrunching like her name had struck him in the heart. "She knew," he said quietly, barely loud enough for Emma to hear. "She always knew." Emma's heart jolted. "What?" Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward. "Grandma knew about Eleanor?" He nodded, still not looking at her. "Not at first, but after a while, yeah. She figured it out." His fingers tapped on the side of his chair, a slow, steady beat like the ticking of a clock. "I think she saw it in me. I wasn't as good at hiding things as I thought I was. She never asked me about it, never threw it in my face, but she knew. She just knew." He rubbed his face with his hands and let out a long, tired sigh. "She forgave me for it, even though I didn't deserve it." Emma felt something sharp twist in her chest. She thought about Grandma Ruth, her soft voice, her gentle patience. All those times she'd seen her grandmother quietly watching her grandfather from across the room with a look that Emma always thought was love. But now she wondered if it had been something more. Love and understanding. Love and grief. "You should have told her," Emma said, her voice tight with emotion. "She was strong enough to handle it. You didn't give her enough credit." His eyes flicked up to hers, his brow furrowed. "I know that now," he said, his voice breaking just a little. "I know it every single day." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes shut tight like he was trying to block out the weight of it all. Emma sat there, still as stone, her heart heavier than it had been when she'd walked in. Her eyes shifted back to the photo she'd found, the one of him and Eleanor. They looked so happy. Not just smiling for a photo happy. It was real. The kind of happiness that stays in your bones. How did he walk away from that? She wondered. How did he walk away and live with it for this long? Her fingers curled into fists on her lap. "Do you know where she is now?" she asked. He hesitated. His eyes opened, slowly, carefully, like he knew the answer was dangerous. "I looked her up a couple years back," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "Didn't know if she was still around, but I found her." His eyes flicked to Emma's, and his voice grew quieter. "She's still in Chicago. Same city she said she'd go to if I didn't take her with me." His gaze dropped to the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "She never left." Emma felt the weight of that statement settle into her bones. She never left. All those years. All that time. She hadn't left. Her fingers tapped on the armrest, her mind racing. "You could call her," she said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "Grandpa, you could call her. You could talk to her." Her voice grew more certain as she spoke, like she was trying to convince both of them. "It's not too late." His eyes snapped to hers, his jaw tightening. "What would I even say, Emma?" he asked, his voice harsher than she'd expected. "What do you say to someone after 50 years of silence? Hey, remember me? The man who promised you everything and gave you nothing." He shook his head, his eyes flashing with something sharp and raw. "I'm too old for that kind of reckoning, kid." Emma leaned forward, her eyes burning with that same stubbornness he'd mentioned earlier. "No, you're not." Her voice didn't waver. "You don't get to hide behind, 'I'm too old.' Not anymore. Not with this." She reached forward, placing the photograph on the table in front of him, pointing right at Eleanor's face. "That woman deserves more than your silence, Grandpa. She deserved it back then, and she still deserves it now." Her words hung in the air like thunder, sharp and unavoidable. Her grandfather's eyes stayed locked on the photo for a long time. His jaw worked, his eyes blinked slow and heavy, but he didn't look away. "She probably hates me," he muttered under his breath. "I wouldn't blame her if she did." Emma leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "She might hate you, yeah." She didn't sugarcoat it. She knew better than that, but she might not. And even if she does, you owe her the chance to tell you that herself. Her words hit him hard. She could see it in his eyes. He rubbed a hand over his face, letting out another long, slow breath. His fingers hovered near the photograph, not quite touching it. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice rough with the weight of everything he just admitted. Emma nodded, but she wasn't letting him off that easy. "Don't think too long, Grandpa," she said quietly, her eyes sharp and focused. "Clocks don't wait." Her words hung in the room like the ticking of the watch. Slow, steady, unstoppable. The house felt different. Not in a way you could see, but in a way you could feel. It wasn't the smell of fresh coffee or the faint hum of the old TV set. It wasn't the creak of the old floorboards or the distant chirping of birds outside the window. No, it was something else. Something heavier. Something unseen but impossible to ignore. It was the weight of a choice that had been avoided for too long, the weight of a past that had been buried but never forgotten. Emma could feel it too. She sat across from her grandfather, her fingers still resting on the edge of the table, her eyes flicking between his face and the photo of Eleanor. He hadn't touched it since she put it in front of him. He just stared at it, eyes fixed on the image as if looking too long might make it disappear. His breathing was steady but shallow, his hands folded together like he was waiting for a judge to deliver a verdict. She could see it all over him, the war going on inside. "Grandpa," she said, her voice softer than before but just as firm. "What are you waiting for?" He didn't respond right away. He blinked slowly, his fingers rubbing against each other like he was winding an invisible clock. "It's been too long, Emma," he muttered, his eyes still locked on Eleanor's face. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Emma leaned forward, her eyes locked on his like she was trying to hand him her courage. "You start by picking up the phone." Her words were gentle, but there was no mistaking the weight of them. "That's it. You just call. You don't need a speech. You don't need to have all the right words. You just start." His lips pressed together, his jaw tight. He looked at her, and for a moment he looked just like he did in the old photo, young, unsure, and trying to figure out how to be brave. "What if she doesn't want to hear from me?" he asked, his voice rough with doubt. "What if I make it worse?" Emma tilted her head slightly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Grandpa, you already think the worst of yourself. It can't get much worse than that." Her eyes softened as she leaned in closer. "But if you call, at least you'll know. And maybe it'll be better than you think." Her words hung in the air like the ticking of a clock. Steady, relentless, unavoidable. He sat there, quiet as stone, his eyes still fixed on the photo of Eleanor. "All right," he said finally, his voice low but certain. His fingers tapped on the edge of the table, a slow, steady rhythm. "All right." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her chest loosening in a way she didn't even realize she needed. She reached for her phone, unlocking it and scrolling through the contacts. "Do you have her number, or should I look it up for you?" His eyes flicked up to hers, a faint trace of humor in his gaze. "You think I'm that old that I wouldn't know how to find someone?" She smirked. "Grandpa, you still call it the Google." He let out a short, dry laugh, the first real laugh she heard from him all day. "Fair point," he admitted, pulling his own phone from his pocket. His hand shook a little as he swiped across the screen. Emma watched him closely, her heart pounding harder than she expected. It felt like they were both waiting for something big to happen, like the last few moments before a thunderstorm breaks. His fingers hovered over the keypad, his eyes staring at the screen like it might burn him. "She might not answer," he said quietly, glancing at Emma as if looking for an escape. "Then you leave a message," Emma said, leaning forward, her eyes sharp and focused. "But you do it, Grandpa. No more waiting." He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. His thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity, but finally he pressed it. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Emma's heart thudded in sync with each ring, her eyes flicking between his face and the phone. On the 4th ring, the line clicked. "Hello." Emma froze. Her grandfather sat up straighter, his eyes wide with shock. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was frozen. His breathing got shallow, his fingers twitching on the edge of the phone. Emma's eyes widened, and she mouthed the words, "Say something." "Hello." The voice was older now, but still firm, still sharp. It had strength behind it, the kind of strength that doesn't fade with time. It was her. It was Eleanor. Henry licked his lips, his eyes darting toward Emma like he was searching for help. She nodded slowly, her eyes steady, her expression calm. "You're okay," she whispered. "Go on." He took a breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. "It's me." Silence. The kind of silence that comes after a firework explodes and everyone is left in awe. For a moment, Emma thought maybe she'd hung up. But then she heard a breath on the other end of the line. Slow, careful. "Henry." He squeezed his eyes shut like her voice was too much to bear. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, it's me." The pause this time was longer. Emma could hear the faint sound of Eleanor breathing on the other end. Her next words were quiet but clear. "Why now?" Emma's eyes flicked to her grandfather's face. She could see it all happening in his expression, the fear, the shame, the hope. His jaw clenched. He squeezed his eyes tighter, his free hand pressing against his temple. When he finally answered, his voice was soft but certain. "Because I'm tired of being a coward." Another pause. Emma's heart was in her throat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Please, Eleanor, please say something." Then finally a soft laugh came through the phone. Not a bitter laugh, not an angry one. It was the sound of something breaking free after being locked up for too long. "Took you long enough," Eleanor said, and Emma could hear the smile in her voice. 50 years, Henry. I should hang up on you right now." Her grandfather let out a breath that sounded like a half-sob, half-laugh. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "You'd be right to." "Yeah, I would," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, strong. "But I'm not gonna." Emma's hand shot up to cover her mouth, tears filling her eyes faster than she could wipe them away. Her grandpa's head hung low, his hand still gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping him steady. For the next hour, they talked. It wasn't easy. There were hard questions, long pauses, and words that didn't always come out right. But they stayed on the line. They stayed. And that was the difference this time. Emma sat there, silent but smiling through tears. She didn't need to hear every word. She didn't need to know every part of their story. She knew enough. She knew her grandfather wasn't going to carry this alone anymore. The weight was finally shifting. After the call ended, her grandfather sat back in his chair, wiping at his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. He looked at her, his eyes red but his smile soft and light. "You were right, kid," he said, his voice hoarse. "Clocks don't wait." Emma smiled, leaning back in her chair, arms crossed, feeling the kind of pride that fills your whole chest. "Nope," she said, grinning at him. "They don't." Her eyes drifted to the watch on the table. The same watch that had started it all. She reached for it, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. It felt different now. Lighter. Quieter. She ran her thumb over the backplate and glanced at her grandfather. "You know," she said, tilting the watch in her hand, "it's fixed now." He smiled at her, his eyes soft, his face at peace for the first time in as long as she could remember. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I guess it is.